really working towards helping Portland become a beloved community. So today's event is, we're hosting it so that we can share with you some of these amazing people. And I welcome you today and as an opportunity to get to listen and share them with you. I want to thank our sponsors for the event. This isn't an expensive event to put on our sponsors. Funding helps provide program services that we're so appreciative of. So Fremont United Methodist Church, ITBOM Consulting, On Point Community Credit Union, Skanska, and Stoll Reeves. Thank you so much. Our moderator today is Shari Dunn. Shari is the principal of ITBOM Consulting. Their approach reimagines institutions, work, and life to address systemic equity and create organizational and cultural redesign. She's an attorney, a news anchor, a professor, and an agent of change. She was the Portland Business Journal Woman of Influence in 2019. So Shari, thank you so much for your generosity and being willing to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon, or morning to afternoon we're going. But, you know, there is so much going on in the world right at this moment. It's hard to catch it. You know, people talk about drinking out of a water hose. And if adults are feeling that way, if adults are feeling stressed in that level, what do we think kids are seeing and hearing? And so we're really excited today to be having a conversation with Jelani Memory, founder and CEO of a kid's book about race, and Myrna Muñoz, PPS principal at Rigler Elementary. And we're going to talk about these issues and how they impact children and how we can talk to children and how we can try to build bridges. But it is very hard. You know, last night we had a debate, a presidential debate, and this is not an endorsement or a denigration of any political party, but some of the things that were said last night were traumatic and traumatizing for adults and children. And so we do want to talk a little bit about that today. But first, I'd like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to talk a little bit about themselves so that you can know them better as we move into this conversation. So Jelani, I have two questions for you. First, what is your background, if you want to tell us a little bit about that? And what are you passionate about? And I know you're about kids and race, but.
Yeah, my background, I'm born and raised here in Portland, Oregon, youngest of four siblings. Dad left when I was 4 and mom raised us all by herself as a nurse working at night. And so I think I learned a little bit of my grit and hard work and how to push through from her. As I find myself now, I'm a father of 6 kids, 2 brown kids, 4 white kids. I get to do some really incredible work with making products that are designed to help empower, challenge, and encourage kids. That came in the form of a previous company I started called Circle. We made really cool parental controls to let families navigate their digital lives. And now it comes in the form of a really innovative and cool kids book publishing company called A Kid's Book About. And we make challenging, empowering, and important books for kids, really of all ages, but specifically for 5 to 9, on everything from depression, racism, cancer, death, white privilege, failure, you name it. We have 30 plus books and couldn't be more proud of the work that we're doing. In terms of what I'm passionate about, I'm really passionate about empowering young people and talking up to them and not down to them, and giving them the dignity that they have real experiences, that they have complex and thoughtful internal lives, and that they have a lot of value to offer the world, even as kids, not just when they become adults.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I remember being a kid, and I just remember being very frustrated that I didn't feel people were listening to me or that they were taking me seriously.
Yeah.
And that's an experience, I think, if you stay in touch with that experience, then there's a way to communicate to kids, right?
Yeah.
Yep. All right, Myrna, can you give us a little bit about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yes, thank you, Shari. First of all, thank you, Shari and Jelani. It is quite an honor to be alongside people changing the world like yourselves. I'm thankful for this conversation. And yes, my mom calls me Myrna Muñoz Lozano. I call myself Myrna Muñoz or Myrna Muñoz. I am proudly bilingual and bicultural. I've been an educator in California and Portland in Oregon now for 20 years. I've done 10 years here and 10 years in California, mostly in bilingual schools, but I've also been an ELD specialist in a setting where there wasn't a bilingual option for kids. So I'm here to tell you bilingual options for kids are of essence if the children are bicultural. I would say my greatest passion in life has been equity, and that passion comes from my immigrant parents. And the way that we interpret equity, I do think it can be different and can be seen in different ways. I'm aligned to the type of equity that's about listening to people about their own experience and letting them define what it is that they need to move their community ahead. So I'm very much of the philosophy that if what's happening in this community is hurting you, join us and let's fix it. But I don't feel like any community that I've ever been a part of needs help from outside people judging or deciding. I do think the answers are in the community. So I see a lot of my passion connected to Jelani's in that children need to be listened to, and children are capable of finding the solutions for themselves if we are able to build trust with them and give them the space that they need. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. Well, we're very excited to have this conversation with both of you today, and I guess we're just going to jump right into it. And our first question is, how do we talk to kids about race and what's happening now? And I do want to expand that question a little bit to what's happening right now, which is the first presidential debate. The first one happened last night, so depending on when you're watching. And it was really traumatic for a lot of people who watched it. And I do equity training. I had a conversation this morning with a client who said their child who is mixed race asked, do we need to get a gun? Like, children are afraid and they're interpreting this fear. And the question is, how do we talk about race in this supercharged? I mean, I guess the question is, first of all, how do we talk about race, period? Because we don't really have a muscle memory for doing it. And then how do we talk about it in this supercharged environment where there is fear and recrimination that children are starting to hear and see? So I don't know, Jelani, if you want to take that opening.
Yeah, why not? Well, I'll give you a little bit of a story. So last night, I'm trying to help get kids ready for bed, and I'm trying to watch the debate at the same time on my smartphone. And I lay down and I've got my 2-year-old brown son and my 9-year-old white son. And he sort of looks over and he goes, what is that? Fake news? He literally, exact phrase he used. And I was like, what do you mean, Titus? What do you mean fake news? And I go, no, it's the presidential debate. And, this is the first time these two candidates are debating each other. And he goes, isn't Donald Trump a racist? And so I want to tell that story to say that he's 9, mm-hmm. and listen to the language and the things that he's asking and what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. Kids are already thinking about these things. They're talking about them. They're reflecting on them. They're conversating with their friends, right? Whether that be through Zoom class or in person, they're talking with their siblings about it. So as how do we talk about race? I think the first thing is we decide that we must talk about race. The decision to not talk about it is an unconscionable one. We can't go down that road. And you're right. We don't have that muscle memory. We don't have those reps in, I think most of us, in talking about race or racism on a frequent basis. And yet our kids are craving it. They're trying to understand it. They're trying to make sense of the world around them. They're trying to make sense of their own skin color and the skin color of those around them and how that affects their experience and their lives. And so that decision to first make sure we are talking about race then begs the question, how do we do that? And I think whether you are white, black, brown, or anywhere in between, I think you have to talk from what your experience is and what you know. I don't think any of us have the expectation that we all should have a graduate degree in African American studies and be able to talk at the highest levels of race relations in America. We can't expect that of every parent, but what we can expect them to do is start with where they're at. And maybe where they're at is, I don't know, or here's what it was like when I was a kid, but now I'm not sure what the answer to these questions are. And they start to navigate and learn about those things alongside their kid. I think that's okay. But they have to start talking about it and have to take those moments, just like my son did last night, where he brings up race or racism and engage and start to conversate and talk instead of saying, shush, we don't talk about that. It's not appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. That's the temptation of too many parents. And I'll say too many white parents, most specifically. And I want to encourage those parents to dive in with your kid, to take those moments seriously, to use it as a teachable moment to start talking about race.
Jelani, I want to just amplify before I go to Myrna a couple, or dig a little deeper into two things. One, it is true that I hear a lot in my work that white parents feel that it's too much for their children. It's too burdensome. It's too scary, But you make the point that kids already are having a conversation, and children of color are not spared that at any point. So how do white parents kind of get over that kind of block that they feel like, it's bad, that they're doing something bad to their kids? You know what I mean by having this conversation?
Yeah, I suppose there's a few points here. One is for the parent to reflect that it might be their fear of themselves talking about it and engaging with the ideas around race and racism, and not their kids' inability to understand it, to cope with it, and to make sense of it. I find that very few kids' innocence is broken or worlds are shattered when they find out that people are different colors. It just doesn't happen. And further, when you start to explain to kids that some kids, because of their color of skin, have different experiences, does not also rattle kids. It does not break their innocence. It's not too much. And in fact, it is likely that they have stories and experiences where they have noticed it happening out in the world, where they've noticed it happening at school, where they've noticed it happening in the classroom, and they can talk very pointedly about it. And I'd say that's as early as, think kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade on up, where they can start to talk about and have those experiences. So I think for parents to identify, and specifically white parents, that fear that they have in themselves and go, why is that fear really there? And to pinpoint and to work through that. Is that really about the kid or is it really about themselves? And then I think further from there is to understand the importance of why it's so critical to talk about race and racism. And I'll just use this as a really small example and then I'll be quiet. No one, especially white parents, wants their kid to be that one kid who says that thing or calls out that other kid or makes an off-color joke in a classroom or in a moment or at a play date. And by not talking to your kids about race, you're almost ensuring that they will eventually be that kid who says the racist thing in class because they don't know. They didn't have a category for it. And guess what? Racism actually can happen by accident. It doesn't always have to be this malicious, on purpose, denigrative thing. It can be something that's done that is completely without intent and yet completely harmful.
Mm-hmm. Myrna, so I'm going to turn this question over to you as an educator, as someone who has worked in education for many years and who has seen how children learn. What would you say about how we talk to kids about race and what is happening now, and especially in light of the first presidential debate that happened last night?
Thank you, Shari. Well, one of the things that I keep coming back to is different conversations that people in our country are having. So on the one hand, I feel like the president's conversation is just denial that racism exists. Last week he signed an executive order saying that it was now against the law or against the rules to talk about racism in schools. And it kind of blurs me for the fact that in my own conversation with equity, or in my own understanding of equity. Equity is about listening to the people. And in my experience, all of the people that look like you all or me are talking about how racism impacts us. I feel that there's like solid evidence everywhere, including like in opportunity gaps in schools, and who's dying during this pandemic, and who gets attention and medical care, and who's getting put into cages. There's just so much that helps us validate what I'm going to call our perspective as people of color. And it feels like the conversation for us is, look, this is happening. And the conversation for people that are in support of this president is, no, it's not. Like, so that a little bit feels like a stuck point, because I think for us to make inroads, at least we have to have the basic understanding and philosophy together that there's a lot of gray in a black and white situation, that there has to be space for a variety of perspectives, and that honestly, the truth is made out of all of our perspectives together. It doesn't really exist apart from us. So one thing I think is really important is to look at your language, to think about, am I using language that validates other perspectives, even when I don't understand them? Is this asset-based language, or am I using deficit language to kind of focus on that otherness, right? So that's something that for myself, I worked really hard on, because I'm married to a Scottish man. Him and I like talk a whole lot about how different words mean. Like, we talk about one word and it means this thing for me and it means that thing for him. And we talk about the experiences that brought us to those meanings. And it really comes up for me that what we need to do is do a careful education of the words that we use when we speak of others and of ourselves. Like, because I do think that's where white supremacy lives. It lives in the uncareful things that we do when we're just rattling off and trying to get something done, ticked off of our list. That's when we make those mistakes. So when I think about children and how to talk about this with children, to be honest, in my community, there's a lot of very successful white families, because guess what they've done? They've put their children into dual immersion, which means the conversation is going to be there, right? Because other children are having it. We don't get to rule what the children talk about. They are talking about what they see and what they live. And putting white children into that gives them exposure to the realness of this, right? So I'm actually at a school where when teachers ask, what unjust situation would you like to fix? I was in a 4th grade classroom just walking around, and I was so impressed that I saw 6 kids in that 4th grade room writing advice to Donald Trump about the way he talked about Mexican people. And I was really proud of them, but more than everything, I was proud that half of them were white and half of them were people of color. You know, like how I keep thinking, how do we unify this conversation? Because our white children are empathetic and loving people. They care too. It's just that we are not feeding them the conversation. So grateful for the parents that are courageously making mistakes, because trust me, the kids already know. They might even help you along and correct you, because I'll tell you, my kids do that. They're like, Mom, that word, it means this and that. And I'm like, what? Thank you. That's what we need to be doing, is handing them the leadership, listening to them, and then moving forward to be the change that we need to be.
Jelani, I'm going to also, because Myrna kind of brought in the answer to this discussion about what is the conversation the dominant culture is having around racism, and what is the separate conversation that communities of color are having around racism. We're not exactly having the same conversation.
Yeah, I'd say I believe that's true, with some caveats. I think there is this defining moment that I watched occurred when George Floyd was murdered, and the videotape was released of that murder, that a whole bunch of people who were dominant culture who would say things like, I don't see color. We don't have a racism problem. That was a long time ago. Can't we just get over slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Moved somewhere, I think, to the middle, where they started to look and said to themselves, wow, maybe this is a problem. This doesn't seem right. Maybe we should be talking about this more. Maybe we should be listening and learning more from people of color in this country and what they've been saying. And I'm watching a sea change of a whole bunch of people who were what I would call dominant culture moving in this place of learning and listening from people of color about why Black Lives Matter and the systemic injustices in our country, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, and starting to change the conversation. And not change the conversation for people of color, because that conversation has been consistent and happening, but change the conversation amongst the dominant culture. Now, I would say there still is a large section of our country who does not believe things like systemic racism exist. In fact, they would call that a reverse racism, right? The idea that that might exist is something that's oppressive or wrong towards them. And that they would, refer to that all these things are political, sort of to take down their candidate or their party or their values. And they would point to things like the, losing the suburbs or, the rising of crime rate here or in these places. And they become dog whistles a little bit around racist caricatures of things that dominant culture would like to maintain as consistent. I mean, there is no greater picture of that than Make America Great Again, as if when women couldn't vote and there was slavery, it was awesome. It wasn't. It wasn't super great.
Spoiler
alert. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, there's a spectrum. And for people of color, and I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for all people of color here. For myself, I all at once feel more disheartened than I've ever felt. Exhausted is the word that you use, Shari. And yet I feel more hopeful than I've ever felt, because never, I think in my lifetime, have I felt that immediate move or shift where I saw white friends, people I worked with, people I talked with, people I went to church with, asking me questions they had never asked before, talking about things I'd never heard them talk about. Confess, relay, address things that I'd never heard come up from them. And I started to call my Black friends and I was like, what is going on? And they're like, I know, it's crazy. What are these conversations? Like, I got white people calling me up out of the blue. And so there's a new conversation happening. And to all the people of color out there, I feel your exhaustion. I feel your tiredness at fielding all the questions. Is this racist? Is this wrong? Is it okay for me to say this? And yet I have a lot of hope because, as Ibram X. Kendi said, Donald Trump did us an amazing favor by uncovering the veil of racism in our country and making it undeniable. There's no longer a space really, truly, where you can say that racism does not exist in our country. And our president did us that favor. And so now we have to reckon with the truth that has existed here since the founding of our country and really, truly figure out how to move the ball forward and to change it.
Yeah, that's the gift, right? Everything has a gift in it. Things that we initially think are bad things or things that are bad for us. We look back in our life and we go, oh, wait a minute, that bad thing was a gift thing, but we couldn't see that at the time. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump is necessarily a gift, but I agree with you that there is we perceive that we have been having conversations about race for years, and in fact, we have not. The actual conversations about a multiracial, multicultural workforce are relatively new. And we are still in the early days of that conversation. So we have a perception that things have, advanced one level, and on another hand, they haven't. And Myrna, to your point about letting the kids lead and see their response, there's been a little kids march against racism like weekly at Beverly Cleary School near where I live. And I have to tell you, I went on this march with these little, well, I was on my balcony, my apartment, and I heard little voices talking, Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, okay, I got to go see what this is about. So I leave my house and I go over there and they're talking about race and they go on a little march over Hawthorne. I'm like, I don't care where these children are going. I'm going where they're going. And, you know, it was all white children, but to hear them talk about Black Lives Matter, say her name, police brutality, I was like, I feel like I've fallen through a door to another reality. Like, and so there is that aspect that is happening, and that is wonderful, and that is amazing. And then on the other hand, children of color are feeling really fearful and really burdened and really unsure. So on the one hand, there's this awakening. And on the other hand, other children are still feeling really burdened and really uncertain about their place. And so, yeah, Myrna, I just want to turn that kind of piece over to you.
I'm grateful to hear this. You made me remember that a couple years ago, we did an empathy survey where we asked different kids how they felt about being bilingual. And I was shocked by the data that my white kids felt that being bilingual, oh, they were going to have jobs. They were going to have a second language to talk to other people all over the world. They were going to have, you know, they saw it as an asset in their lives. And guess what? My children of color, they were like, I don't want to speak Spanish when I grow up. I'm hoping to be done with this, because they've had to experience so much that they've linked to the experience of being different. To be honest, I agree with you 100%. We talk the talk, but we don't make the actions that need to be made. Everybody knows that in order to improve racial equity, we need to do more training on unconscious bias. I feel like it's super clear. I just experienced a change with my medical team, because guess what they did? They went through unconscious bias training. I literally asked my doctor this morning, what happened? I noticed a change in your staff. When I had a meeting with her 6 months ago saying, listen, do you not want me at your office? Because this is how your people are treating me when I call. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm always like seeing like, oh, maybe I'm going to become addicted to morphine. Like they have to extra be careful when it just really, I feel it. And I told her, and this last time that I was here, everybody was kind. There was nobody asked me if I needed a translator. Like, how is it that as adults, we know that this unconscious bias study of ourselves is necessary to follow the children, but we cannot and will not invest in it? As an example, my own district, I've been at Portland Public now for 4 years, and I arrived before they deleted the unconscious bias training. So everybody was going through that training, right? That after that first year, they disintegrated the equity department and no longer do that training. And in my humble opinion, it has made a huge impact in our system. It means people are coming in without the training about how much this matters. And then we all have to deal with microaggressions throughout that system, because it's no longer a key philosophy or value as a base. So that's how I see it. I see education as the key. That's why I'm so grateful to Jelani writing these much needed books representing our voices, because we just need to amplify how this affects us.
Well, and I have to say that education piece, Myrna, is really important, because I do a lot of training with adults who tell me they feel ignorant. They feel ashamed at how much they don't know. And so part of it, back to your point, Jelani, is if are parents reacting to what their kids, are they reacting to themselves, right? Because many feel ashamed, but our education system didn't tell us. They don't tell us about Bacon's Rebellion. They don't talk about how the Irish became white. They don't talk about whiteness as a concept, and you can easily trace it, but we don't do that. And so they don't know. So they don't know how to talk about it. And so it just is this circle. And so then I guess the question is, the next question we have is, if that's the case, how do we learn to listen and love better? How do we find what's possible in what can feel like an impossible situation?
Yeah, that's a really tough question.
Mm-hmm.
And I can really only speak for my life and the things that I've seen work, that I have tried, that I've failed at. I have found remarkable power in telling my own story, and relaying my own experiences. Sometimes those have folks, when they hear those, they feel judgment, or they feel the burden of not having known, or wishing they had known, or a sense of guilt. And other times there's liberation, there's freedom in that. There's getting to hear a story that you previously didn't know, that now you know, and you can do better, you can be better, you can understand better. I have traveled within the Black community and within a lot of white communities. Through my work, I often find myself in rooms with only white people. And I realize that there's a heavy burden placed on me there, and an undue burden, one that shouldn't be there, but is there to represent a whole people, which is not something I can't possibly do. And yet taking on the responsibility to go, can I communicate some of my story here? Can I elevate this conversation? Because this may be one or two or out of 3 times that they ever enter into a situation where they interact with somebody of color like me in a context like this, and try and shape their idea, their view, their opinion, while also knowing that it is not my responsibility. And that for all people of color, it is not your responsibility to move or to change or to affect the minds of white individuals who do not understand your experience, who do not empathize with you or sympathize with you. It's not your job to dive into every Facebook comment thread and try and change the direction. But it is worthwhile work if you can do it. And if you can take those in your community and affect their hearts and their minds, try. Now, to white individuals, it is your responsibility that if you know, and once you know, it's your job to go spread that good news, right? To go talk to your family, to go talk to your friends, to go talk to your colleagues. Because I feel like the pressure or the burden of that privilege that's been given to white individuals in this country, whether that's the privilege of not being subjected to systemic racism or the privilege of the privileges built up over time, to help change those hearts and minds to see the world in a more equitable way. And I don't think that's a feel really bad about yourself mantra. I don't think that's a huge guilty mantra. I think it is one that is enormously liberating, where you get to give everyone the dignity of having a unique experience, an identity, whether that has to do with their culture or color of skin. And you get to recognize the hardships and experiences, whether they're present for people of color or whether they are not present for you, based solely on your race and place within this country. Now, that's a bit of a roundabout way to answer your question, in that I think a lot needs to change. And I think there is a role for people of color to play in that. And they have played that historically, traditionally. But I think in a lot of ways now is this sort of perfect time for white folks to step up and do some of that good work while learning, while listening.
You know, I woke up this morning after the debates, and I posted on Facebook Biggie Smalls song, "It Was All a Dream," and the phrase kept coming to me. People say, "Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure if he's, you know, Donald Trump is a racist. I'm not sure." And I'm like, if you don't know, now you know. You know, like, I don't know what else to tell you here.
Yeah.
Like, you know, pretty clear, right? And maybe it's only clear looking through these eyes, but it seems incredibly clear from this vantage point. And the scope of the work, Myrna, I mean, like, people feel overwhelmed by it. And I know when we were talking in like a little prep session, I was saying, I try to take the wisdom of children in this regard with the little thing when kids say, you know, how do you eat an elephant? You know, one bite at a time, which is a funny little thing, but it's actually true. about any large scale task. You know, sometimes people can feel like, I just don't even want to start. It's just too much. It's just too big. I just can't even start. But, you know, once again, people of color don't have that luxury. That is a bit of a luxury to say that, you know, you live in a space where the start is your life, your work, your interactions. And so what do we say to people about how do they move toward unity? How do they build on their strengths and build on the strengths around them when they feel like the problem is so big?
I think one of the things that comes up for me in this conversation is the concept of discipline juxtaposed with the concept of restoration. So one of the things I'm a little bit like, oh, I wish that they had been more careful about the whole defund the police, because we don't mean throw all that money away. We mean, can we invest in support systems rather than discipline systems? I think that's a big picture thing, right? Like when I hear Donald Trump talk about that no racism is there and that the police is on his side and that the military's on his side, what I hear is that he wants to solve this problem via discipline. It's going to scare the children and the adults because discipline has not worked for this country. I don't understand why we think punishment is a great way to get to learning. Learning is going to require real work, hard work, and that's the language of restoration in my mind. We need community circles. We need to talk about real restitution for people harmed because of inequitable systems. And that's what's going to get us there. In my little school, we are a restorative justice school, which means that, yes, we have a discipline policy and we have discipline to do, but we always start with what happened. Everybody gets to tell their part of what happened. And in my experience, that's where unity is born, right? A lot of people just don't know what the other people are going through, and making a window for people to see. For example, right now, right, I'm a principal, I'm a professional. I'm doing my very best to keep up during this pandemic. But at the same time, I'm a person of color. I'm part of the people most affected by this. So I know lots of people that have died. I know lots of people right now that are in the hospital that don't have medical insurance. You know, I don't understand why we push back on everybody having medical insurance. It's the least we could do considering where this country came from, whose back it's built upon. It's had costs already that we need to even up. And to be honest, I don't feel like that's in any way controversial. Every time that I've been in a restorative justice circle done correctly, where we start with everybody saying their part individually, being heard and seen, the result is a community that's more united, a community that helps, because I myself believe in restitution. And guess what? I built systems that honor that. So I really honestly, like, I've had no pushback about that in my community. My white families are just as happy as my families of color that we operate that way. So I really honestly don't see the controversy except for people that feel like they're going to lose some power in this. That's the only difference I see. That's where I make the, oh, you're worried about your power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's human that people see things as a loss and a gain. We tend to see things, not to be ironic, but black and white in the United States. We don't have a lot of shades of gray. Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, as opposed to cooperative action where we all win together or we all lose together. Because at the moment, we're in an all lose together situation with our health, with our environment, and we have to move toward a more unifying, what does it mean for us all to win together mindset. I do want to remind folks who are watching and listening that we welcome your comments and questions, and we will be integrating them in. So if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to post them and they'll get to me. I do have a question. One question is about, you know, certain terms are triggers. And I don't know if they mean triggers for the listener or inclusivity, diversity, systemic racism. So how do you have conversations with people for whom these terms are foreign, and how do you define them? You know, what I like to tell people in my equity training is part of the problem is a lot of our work is we're doing it 3/4 of the way into the novel. So I start introducing characters 3/4 way into the novel that you don't even know anything about. Who is Systemic? I never saw him. He wasn't in the early part of this book. So I like to, in my trainings, roll us all the way back to race and racism origin story in the United States as a way to move forward. And that part of that is an educational piece that we don't get that education in school. Because of that, we don't know who Systemic is when he shows up 3/4 away into the novel, right? But Systemic goes back to slavery, goes back to Bacon's Rebellion, goes back to Reconstruction, goes back to Jim Crow, Systemic has been here. He's been in the picture the entire time. We just haven't seen it, right? So the question is, and I know a lot of white folks have this issue when they're talking to family members, they say these terms and then family members immediately jump on them. And for children, is this the kind of language to work with them on, Jelani?
Yeah, I think so. And maybe the only ones that the language can be used on effectively in some ways, because I've had those experiences where you're around the table with your, white family members and you try and engage with them, and it's just like this big wall as soon as you use one of the trigger words, right? And there's a whole number of reasons why that's true, and I think your approach and what you talked about it really being an education problem and sort of going back into history and walking up to that moment so that word has clarity and makes sense, is an important way to go about it. For kids, they are, for all intents and purposes, a blank slate, right? It'll be their first introduction to any of it. Now they'll have some experiences to pull from and some stories, but for the most part, they're like a big sponge. And so when you use a word like systemic racism, or go back into history and start talking about certain moments, it'll be their first time hearing about it. They won't have spent a lifetime either building up an idea of America or good or race or the American dream that essentially has to be torn down to replace a new thing that is far more true and yet threatens the very existence of their identity. Again, kids don't have that. And so I think entering in with kids is far more easy and maybe all the more important, because imagine, and this is really why we make the books for our company the way we do, is imagine a young boy or a young girl learning about mental health disorders at 5, 6, 7, learning about systemic racism, learning about the Holocaust, learning about name all the topics you can think of, all the really important meaty stuff. What kind of adults they can grow into, having grown in that conversation as they grow up through each stage of life, that by the time they reach adulthood, it wasn't one thing that they got told once when they were 18 and in college, and it was one, answer on a test, but it was an ongoing conversation where they got to build in their experience in their life. I think those things, they weave into a far more sort of healthy, happy, integrated person who can be far more empathetic, who can understand the experiences of others, who can understand their own identity, and I think be able to wrestle with the idea, especially here, of living in America and both loving it and hating it at the same time, being able to see its beauty and its faults and not letting those things detract from each other necessarily. So to put a nail on it, I think we have to have these conversations with kids. It's a must.
Mm-hmm. It's the duality, right? I mean, I have begun starting all my trainings with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that you don't have to hate America to critique America. It is not a hatred-based critique. In the same way you might critique your children, you want them to be better, or you care about somebody who has a drug or alcohol issue, you're not hating them by critiquing them. But to Myrna, to your point, as educators and people in this field, we are facing a tremendous pushback with the federal government Institute 1776 to counter 1619, which is to say that the story is, I won't call it a childish story because children are more sophisticated than that, a story that is not nuanced, that is a good and bad story. And so it's going to be imperative more than ever for parents to step into this space to educate themselves and educate children, because we cannot count on the educational system for a variety of reasons, not for the educators who are part of it, but for structural reasons, to be able to properly communicate this information. The fear of what Jelani is saying is that the express reason they don't want to do it is because they don't want children to grow up to be those type of adults you're talking about. They want children to grow up to be the kind of adults who see blind allegiance to a country and an uncritical eye, right? So how do parents, Myrna, supplement what you're able to teach in the classroom?
I think I agree with Jelani. I think the kids can. They just need to be given the space. I think about like what I do with words that trigger me in a relationship where I build trust, right? And what I do is I say, this word that you used triggered me. Help me understand what you mean when you say that word. And then I contribute what that word conjures up for me. For me personally, a lot of the things that I have that are like, is like around colonialism, right? Like, so when I think about bilingualism and I have to fight for kids to have access to Spanish, that still like has levels, because Spanish is also a colonist language. It's not the language that the people that are coming here to our schools as Latinos need. They need other native languages, and we're just so behind that I'm having to fight for Spanish, which is a whole other colonial thing. So I think about the places where I've been able to make change with trigger language, right? And I think about how I start that conversation with, we have a lot of work to do. How do I build trust with you so that we can get to this important work? Because I don't think difficult conversations can happen the way that Donald and Joe tried last night, right? Talking over each other, disrespecting each other, calling each other names. Like, how do we make a space between you and me that is filled with trust enough that I could say, hey, when you say the word empire, it triggers me, because you know what it brings up for me? Everything that empire did to my people in order to be this powerful. Like, how do we make the space to have those details conversations that are likely to move us forward?
I'm smiling because, this conversation comes up with adults. And I think to Jelani's point, children are a little bit more of a blank slate that you can help them. But adults get into the circle of, well, you can't say anything now. You just can't say anything to anybody. And what I often say to people in training is, you're right. You can't say anything, because you used to just say anything to people and nobody wants to hear anything, And so, what does it mean to learn not to say anything? You used to be able to go to work and say anything to women, anything to people of color. We don't do that. And so there is a balancing, right? And so with children, we have the opportunity to start them fresh, right? They don't have the expectation that they should be able to say anything, right? And so how do we help them, understand, to get off on the right foot about what it means to be in mutual conversation and mutual aid and dignity with each other in conversation. And Jelani, I actually want to follow up, and I don't know if you want to share, as to what did you say to your 9-year-old?
Well, so what's great is he's got a bunch of great books in his life, namely mine, and we've had a bunch of conversations. I'm never a big fan of trying to have big declarative statements with my kids. I want them to see the gray area. I want them to see the nuance. I also want them to not declare big, heavy statements about people that are sort of final and sort of assume that they have the right to judge the entirety of that person, having never known them. That being said, I said, yeah, he kind of is a racist. And we sort of left it at that because we have enough conversations about it. And again, the gift that Donald Trump has given us is that there's no nuance there.
No.
There's no attempt to duck away from it. It's just right there on national television. And so we can just kind of easily call it what it is. And for individuals who are unsure about how to identify it, it likely means that they haven't been able to identify it either in themselves or in our country writ large.
Mm-hmm. I have two really good questions that are kind of related to each other. First is, how do I ask my kids' school what diversity training they do and they require? And then the other part of that question is, what training can you use at home and school? And I know we have books. We have books for kids at home and school. But yeah, that's a good question. Can parents move things forward by saying to their school, hey, I want to know what you're doing about this, and I want you to tell me what resources. Myrna, you want to take that one?
Absolutely, parents can. I would say that parents have all of the power. You guys elect your school board. You get to go tell them what you want in your schools. Portland Public, for example, talks a whole lot about equity. I know we publicly came out and supported the Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm super proud of. A lot of Oregon districts didn't do that and actually told their teachers that if they said anything like that, so people are under duress, but also like demand from your district that they say the right things and then follow up with actions, right? So that's great that we believe we want this. And are you going to start doing the unconscious bias training again? Or what is it that you're doing in order to change this and shift this, right? Because the other thing we haven't talked about, and I would love to mention, is the fact that there's lots of people that are mixed and see themselves differently, and that all changes what triggers you, how you present. I'm thinking about one of my students a few years ago who presents as white but is Black, and how he used the N-word and what it caused in his life because of how he presented. Things are much more complex, I think, sometimes than we're able to even understand because we're not doing enough about this. So how do we help Americans open up their eyes to see that culture is a thing that exists? It's not invisible. You have it no matter what color you are in America, and it feeds your perspective. You need to be aware of like, oh, this is related to this in my life, and how does it show up? What does it do in the world? So yes, advocate for what you wish you want your kids. Like I would advocate for my kids need to be treated in the same asset-based language that every kid gets treated in. My kid needs to be recognized for their power, their voice, for everything that they are without being put down like, oh, they talk too much. Or they like, that's already, somebody's in deficit if they think your child talks too much, but another kid who talks too much but happens to be white is, oh, brilliant, a spokesperson is going to go far. You need to be noticing those things, bringing them up to your educators, to your organization, and making sure they know that you expect them to have praxis with what it is that they're saying. Black Lives Matter, so we need to educate the Black kids just as well as we do the white ones. That's what that has to mean.
Mm-hmm. And Jelani, I know that you have books which are a resource for parents, but what other resources would you suggest, or how would you suggest they use the materials that you have?
Yeah, so I think about this really in three areas. The first is introducing some of those materials into classrooms, into your home. Plenty of great resources. Buy my book, buy any other book. Just having representation in those books is important, right? I think it'd be very easy for any white family to go through their children's books on their, little bookshelf of children's books, and maybe realize that there are a lot more white kids in those books than there are brown kids, if there are any brown kids, right? And so diversifying that bookshelf just so that they can see different kinds of kids all having different kinds of experiences. So that's sort of thing one. Thing two is fostering those direct conversations, again, in the home and at school, that use the actual words about a thing. So instead of talking about being mean or not nice or treating everybody respectfully or kind, is using words like racism, like sexism, like addressing those things directly so that kids have a language built around that, and it's specific, because kids, they crave that specificity, right? It's not political language to them, it's just language. And then the last thing is for grown-ups to do their homework, is read a book, watch a movie, like get up to speed. And I, as a person of color, am not exempt from that. Right? Like, I want to continue to be a student and learn and grow, so that as my kids get older and they ask me more complicated questions, I'm not just like pulling from the same well every time of like, well, I guess slavery happened for like a few hundred years, and it ended Abraham Lincoln, but to be able to be more knowledgeable as we go, not so that I can be a race relations expert, but so that I can raise my kids, right? And there is no topic that is more fundamental to the fabric of our country, of our history, of our systems, of our government, of the businesses that have been built, than the idea and the concept of race and racism. So it's an educational component of all of our lives as adults, to be able to not just educate ourselves, but that allows us to educate the kids around us.
That's a really good point. I mean, which is actually great modeling for children, right? So, because what you're modeling for children is lifelong learning, right? Which we all should be engaged in. We should all be learning until the last minute, and hopefully at the last minute we'll learn something else we didn't know, right? We should always be learning. And so modeling for your children that lifelong learning is something you're just as deeply engaged in as they're engaged in, can have deep implications for all of their life beyond race, right? And we don't, as a culture, seem to value lifelong learning very much. We know what we know and we're done. And so it's that piece of it. The other kind of piece, I think, just to really focus in on children and their feelings, is that, I remember the first time someone called me the N-word. I think almost every Black person remembers that. And I know the girl's name, which I won't mention here in case somebody somehow is actually related to her, because somehow in life that happens. But I remember her whole name, and I don't remember much. And I remember I got into a physical altercation with her as a result of that. And she says to me, "I don't know what it means. I just heard my father say it." And I believe that. I believe that to be true, that we were in a childish altercation, and she understood that this word has some power to do something to her. So I'm going to say this out loud, right? So, understanding that is really important. Understanding that kids are aware about power dynamics. They're not unaware of power. I mean, Mean Girls, kids ostracizing, kids figure out power dynamics real quick, and so that they use race in the same power dynamics ways that adults do. And how do we kind of shine them off of that is a question, I guess. Myrna.
Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the Restorative Justice Circle is an amazing tool that way, right? And I know that when you put somebody that's been through that in a Restorative Justice Circle, it has to be careful, right? Because it already has an effect, and now there's the perpetrator, and you're explaining it to them, what effect it has, what historical, but that's why I say it's so important to do the pre-work, right? Because before I make a circle and put it together, I'm going to make sure that this child understands what they need to understand about that word, how deep that pain is, and how it has a history. And I go as far as asking the child if they want to be a part of that history, and the children immediately are like, no. So, So that's what I see. I see restoration as the way. Every time I've done that, because I have done that, Shari, I have had to have a circle where this exact thing happened. It ends in tears and respect. It ends in white students telling others, teaching others, doing many lessons about why they shouldn't, which goes back to Jelani's comment about who is responsible for it. Right? That child already went through it. They don't need to also have me make the mistake of them going to tell the whole school. You know what I mean? Like it feels a little bit like it needs to be grounded in what we know is best for children, what we know is best for children that have been harmed, and how we can move forward as a community. And I'll tell you, in the community where I work, I have had no pushback about restoring the community. Most families are like, my kid did what? You know, they don't want that either. And we still have the aggressions in our building. It's just that the way we process them is around healing the building back to who we are, a community in kindness that loves each other.
That is a great way to end on. I just dropped my phone for those of you wondering what the noise was, because I'm taking messages on my phone and then I was like, oh, right out of my hand. So yeah, that is a great message to end on. I want to thank you, Myrna and Jelani, for being part of this conversation. I mean, it's been hopefully helpful for parents, hopefully transformative to think more deeply, to understand that children can hold more than we think they can, to treat them with respect and to start them off on the right foot. You know, nobody wants their kid to be that kid. I know people don't. And so how do we get there? And that's how we change society, right? One bite at a time, one piece at a time. We want to thank again Fremont United Methodist Church, myself, ITBOM and Cunsolting, On Point Community Credit Union, Skanska and Stoll Reeves for being sponsors. You know, you can get a link online to find out more about Portland Backpack. I encourage you to support this organization and support the children in need. And we just encourage you to continue the conversation and share this. You can share it on LinkedIn, on other platforms. It's a link will be available. So we depend on you to get this message out even further. So thank you all. Thank you, Portland Backpack, for having me. And thank you all for coming.